So here we are in the Swiss Alps in the beautiful canton of Valais, and we're very, very honored to welcome Philipp Kruse, lawyer, Swiss lawyer. And first of all, how was your trip here?
Thank you for the invitation. It's a very nice small village, probably the smallest village in Switzerland here in the canton of Valais.
So could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are from?
Yes, so my name is Philipp Kruse. I'm a lawyer, practicing lawyer with my own law firm in Zurich. I studied at the University of Bern. I did my bar exam in 1997. As of then, I worked first as a commercial lawyer, and then as of 2003, specialized on tax law, which has quite a bit of constitutional law and a very significant amount of being bound to the legislation, the rule of law. Without any legislation, there will be no taxes. So I did that. Also, I worked twice for a cantonal law authority, Canton of Zurich, Canton of Lucerne. I gained some insight into how authorities operate, how they work. And as of end of 2000, I decided to specialize on these actual events that we are talking about today, because more and more people approached me who had felt severe damages in form of financial damages, but most of them were talking about inflictions of their personal freedom, and they wanted me to help them fighting against the duty to wear masks, fighting against the duty for their children to wear masks in schools, against the mandate to test in schools on a regular basis. I literally led court proceedings against all types of COVID-19 measures. Ultimately, 1 year ago, mid of July, I submitted together with my team. I have built up a team, and otherwise it would not have been possible. I've submitted a criminal complaint against Swissmedic, which is the supreme authorizing and supervising authority in Switzerland when it comes to medical products. So I submitted a criminal complaint against this Swissmedic for unlawfully authorizing these mRNA substances, these experimental drugs, and for deceiving people by submitting or publishing wrong information as to the qualities of these products. Yes, I have two children, 12 and 17. I don't see them very, very often, unfortunately, but still I consider my family a happy family.
That's good.
Yep.
And how would you answer to anybody who would accuse you of being anti-vax? Are your children vaccinated?
Yes, they are vaccinated up to this point against all the usual diseases according to the plan our children doctor has received from the canton or from the Swiss health authority. We have followed this schedule until last year. When it came to the second vaccination, HPV, we went into it in more detail. I was reluctant to do it. So after this entire period, we look more into the details of these vaccinations than before. But I can say, yes, so far, all these usual vaccinations were applied to my children.
So for you, what were the most important numbers with regards to the pandemic? So from 2020, when we started talking about deaths and hospitalizations of COVID, what for you stood out as the most important statistics?
Well, in public, we had just actually two kinds of numbers that were published. Number one were the cases, the COVID-19 cases that rocketed in March 2020 for the first time, first wave, then a second time, October, November 2020. You just looked into the newspapers, in television, and you saw these rocketing numbers of COVID cases. And then the second kind of number were the added up numbers of deceased people, of deaf people, COVID-19 death apparently. That made me suspicious because early in 2020, more and more information came up and was available that the method how to detect this disease by the so-called PCR test was actually not as valid as it was promoted, by far not a safe method for an evidence of a disease, of a COVID-19 disease. So I looked this up. I realized that this test was not validated, that it was not even in the scientific community accepted to be a proof for a disease, and even the president of the president of sciences in Switzerland, Professor Marcel Tanner himself, in a podium discussion in Aarau on the 12th August 2020, he said, well, nobody has ever made the case that with a positive PCR you can prove a disease. That has never anybody said. And just recently, 2 weeks ago, end of or beginning of June, in an interview led by Roger Bittel, he confirmed that again. He said the PCR test is not a suitable method to prove a disease. And when then confronted with the question, but we have this COVID-19 law just right now extended until end of June 2024. This is based on the PCR test logic. He immediately said, this is wrong. This must be just a political decision, but it is not a scientific decision. So just speaking about these figures, we see on the one side figures that were published based on the PCR test results, looked very frightening to everybody who did not look further into other figures. And on the other side, well, as soon as you started getting more and more information, you realized, well, if we compare 2020 from the perspective of excess mortality, if we do it correctly with the correct method, and we compare 2020 overall as a rate per 1,000 inhabitants, then the 2020 overall compared to the 10 previous years does not stick out at all. There's just one age group of 80 plus that compared to the previous 10 years is slightly higher, just slightly higher compared to the previous 10 years, but not significantly. I'm talking about a method that is accepted by WHO with the name of the age standardized ratio of mortality. So it's a ratio on numbers of deceased people per 1,000, and it is age adjusted. So it takes into account the structure of the age group and the growing number of aged people. So this was one aspect. Then the fact everybody could see that the average age of deceased people was 84 years old. When we even looked at the official figures from our federal government, Federal Office of Statistics, when we looked at the numbers for the 0 to 64, 65 years old, which is the working age group, we didn't see any abnormality at all, even in absolute figures. So in pandemics, in epidemics, you would expect that also this age group would show a significant deviation from previous years. That was not the case. Then what else? I saw that as of week 13, 2020, there were no flu cases anymore at all. 0 flu. So that, to me, it is impossible that just from one week to another, there's no flu anymore. and you have the previous thousands of years, you have the flu all the time, accompanying people's life, or at least the last 100 of years. So that for me was a hint that this test was unable to defer, to make the difference, to detect whether it was a flu, or ordinary flu, or whether it was a COVID-19 flu. Yeah, so, and then also, of course, I did not construct and looked up all these figures myself. I was looking for good scientists, for good references, statistician, mathematician. In summer 2020, there were really many good statistics available. So actually, I started as a lawyer to work together with these professionals who were capable of putting the figures into the right perspective. And this is what it is all about, putting the figures into the right perspective. And this is something what we always do as human beings, and what we should do. And so once you start doing that, and you realize, okay, yes, we have some strong figures at a certain age group for a limited period of time in March 2020 and in October, November 2020. But number one, it's limited to a certain age group. And number two, the cause why they died is far from being established to be just COVID only. When you look even at the official statistics, they show literally 80% of them have a multiple number of co-causalities. So it is far from being established that just COVID was the reason. And we have not even talked about the consequences of these very harsh, restrictive, invasive measures and mandates that have in particular put elderly people in a very difficult situation. Many of them were not allowed to leave their room, were not allowed to be visited by their loved ones, were not allowed to follow their daily routine and walk, have good hours with their friends together, go singing or play games. So that in itself would be, under normal conditions, also be suitable for accelerating the way to death. And more, I mean, we came across to so many statistics, and all of these statistics I've brought into my legal cases, which I have led over 25 cases over all the instances. I'm talking about ordinary court procedures.
So referring to these legal cases, one of the most important ones I would say is the PCR case that you had at the federal tribunal, if I'm correct, in November of 2021. Could you explain us a little bit more about that and the other cases that you led?
So this is a judgment from the Federal High Court, Federal Court of Justice. This judgment was issued in November 2021. For those who want to look it up, you can easily put it into Google, 2C_228/2021, and then there on the consideration E.2, you will find that the court said that it is notorious, it is even notorious that PCR test, this method, cannot be used as a proof for disease. What was this case about? The case was not centrally about the PCR. It was about the mask mandate for children in the canton of Bern at the age of 10 onwards. And they were, as many other children in Switzerland as well, under the mandate to wear masks in school every day for weeks and weeks and weeks as of beginning February 2021. So a group of parents, more or less 20 parents, entrusted me with this mandate, and we went up directly to the High Court. That was a side result. We were very happy. The court, in this consideration, they say, oh well, the plaintiffs, they have put so much evidence on the table to prove that the PCR is not capable of proving a disease. It would not have been important to do so. It would not have been necessary because it is notorious. But ultimately, the court did not follow our main claim we made. And the main claim was, of course, to make sure that children don't have to wear masks, because this mask, they are not necessary and they are harmful. These two things we have proven. And there the court just said, yeah, you know, although the PCR test does not prove anything, but the government has given other reasons anyway for imposing this duty to wear masks. We have a general difficult situation in our health system. So everybody has to contribute to bring things back to normal. And as masks are not really proven to be harmful, there they said we did not manage to prove that masks are harmful. But the burden of proof is at the other side. The burden of proof is with the government. Number one, that there is such a great threat to the health of children that they have to do something in the first place. And we all know there's no such thing as a threat to children when it comes to COVID. And number two, that such a measure would be effective and would be safe. So this burden of proof was with the government. They never proved anything at all, and still the government was protected by the court. And that already shows the general pattern I've seen in over 25 court cases in general. The main purpose of all of these court cases was to submit a legal situation that, to my understanding and to the understanding of my clients, just created harm only, did not have a positive, beneficial effect. To submit these legal situations to a reconsideration, to an independent legal reconsideration by an independent court. And still today I can say that all of these different types of mandates that I submitted, mask testing, then the certificate, which restricts the access to the public life. I've also brought this to the court. And all of these cases, actually, the biggest one are still pending. They're still pending. And there's still a chance that the Swiss Supreme Court will ultimately come to a good judgment. But so far, when we are today, 21st of June, 2023, we have not one single judgment where the Swiss High Court has put its judgment at the place of the decision of the government, because their standard reasoning, they say, well, in times of pandemics, this is emergency. And in an emergency, courts shall never interfere with the decisions of the competent authorities. And as long as the authorities are competent, and as long as they apply the expert advice of the competent experts, we are out. As court, we don't do an independent reassessment. And so, just looking at the court system, we have not seen so far one single judgment where a judge dared to perform his constitutional duty to subject a decision of an authority to an independent reassessment and correct it. And so consequently, when it came then to end of 2021, when our Swiss government, based on the already introduced health certificate, we had a regime as of 13th of September 2021. The regime was, if you wanted to go to public places, join any sports events, go to a concert, go to a restaurant, you had to show this electronic certificate. You had three options. Number one, test with a negative result. Number two, showing that you had COVID, but you were recovered, which is a question of you cannot influence, either you are or not. And number three, the proof that you were vaccinated. So we called this 3G. And as of, I think it was 21st of December, right before Christmas 2021, they reduced it to 2G, either recovered or vaccinated. And there were many professions like the restaurants, like sports, like culture, who were not even allowed to perform their profession without having one of these two options themselves. So that forced so many people into vaccination. It was a coercion into vaccination by the facts. There was no such thing as free will to decide at all, and let alone the wrong information that was spread. So the only thing, I mean, any court case would have come too late. The press was not answering, was not trying to even bring another view than the official one. So together with some lawyers colleagues, we founded the Swiss Lawyers Committee, Schweizer Juristenkomitee. And as such, I think it was on 21st of December, we addressed an analysis of the facts with a brief analysis of the legal conclusions. We sent this to the Swiss Parliament, literally to each member of Parliament, by email and by postmail, asking for immediately stop this regime of certificate, because it is such a system is unconstitutional. You know, for many reasons. I can come back to that. And we asked them, please do a reassessment, a reconsideration, because the Swiss Parliament is the highest supreme power in the Swiss constitutional order, and they are capable actually to correct wrong policies, or at least to have the effect of making the government do a proper reassessment. They could easily have said, okay, now we want to see what is actually the true method of, analyzing the threat from COVID. We want to see it. Give us proof. They can ask the government, provide us proof that PCR is the true method of proving that we have a real threat. They could have easily stopped this COVID-19 certificate as well. No response came. So this is what we wrote. This letter is on the internet. We published it for signature by other lawyers. I think something between 350 and 400 lawyers in whole Switzerland have co-signed this letter. And we asked the Swiss Parliament, please do a reconsideration, a reassessment, put this PCR test under scrutiny. It was already done by the Swiss Supreme Court, and ultimately stop it. We didn't receive a response. The Swiss Parliament reacted after one or two additional letters. They responded on 21st of February 2022, and what they wrote was, as long as we are under a pandemic public health emergency of international concern declared by the WHO, we cannot perform an own reassessment. And that was shocking news to hear, that the supreme constitutional power in Switzerland, in the form of the Swiss Parliament, declares itself not competent, incapable of performing a reassessment of some of the most basic questions. How dangerous is this virus to our Swiss citizens? Is it, well, we cannot do it because WHO still maintains this pandemic. So ultimately, still today, we can say that none of these three constitutional powers, neither our Swiss Federal Council, nor the Swiss Parliament, nor any of the Swiss courts, has so far ever put under scrutiny the preconditions for all these restrictions, mandates, and duties and measures. And so we have not seen a reassessment, a process of reconsideration whatsoever, remaining the media. And this is a different topic, a different question. I don't know whether you're interested.
Absolutely, because you talk about the court of public opinion, and usually use the media to get information out so the pressure can be put from the public to the politicians. But the media was blockading any kind of information, if I understand correctly.
This is absolutely correct. In Switzerland, it was nothing different than in other countries. All our mainstream media, the established media, they only presented the view of the government, meaning rising positive cases, COVID-19 cases, and rising numbers of death, people, excess mortality, and the only solution to be this vaccination. They were far away from talking about the validity of the PCR test method, and they were really far away from addressing the question, how useful and how safe and effective is this new mRNA vaccine? It was simply not discussed. And everybody who brought this question up in the public sphere was framed one side or the other, but was not admitted to a public debate. And still today, we don't have a public debate on that part. We have seen some attempts to establish a podium discussion, public debate situation with representatives from both sides. What we have seen so far is that all representatives that were invited from the government, whether it's on the federal level or the cantonal level, but also from parties that were in favor of the measures, they simply did not show up, they did not come, they declined their participation. So still today, we are far away from seeing just a neutral, objective, independent reassessment with respect, although we are 3.5 years away from this first moment of COVID-19. Why is that? Well, some people say they don't want to hear about it anymore. It is over, let's put it behind. And others, I can only speculate whether they have a bad conscience or whether they are still in fear of discovering the truth. But one thing is sure, it is a basic standard and globally acknowledged standard of quality control and quality management to subject your own actions to a very strict, neutral reassessment, to do it better next time, to learn from the past. And so we cannot avoid doing it. We cannot afford not doing that as a society if we want to avoid mistakes from the past. And we have to become better. We cannot throw out of the window all the money we did. We cannot do again shutdowns, lockdowns, close schools, shut down the entire business, and just impose as the sole only solution new experimental vaccines. This is not a reasonable way of going forward.
Speaking of money out the window, how much money was spent in Switzerland on the tests?
On the test, it was something from the beginning until today. We are in June 2023. It was altogether the Federation and the cantons more than 2.5 billion Swiss francs, which is significantly more than what was spent for the vaccines. Much more money was spent for the tests than for the vaccines.
And now that we're no longer in a public health emergency of international concern, as of the 5th of May, which Tedros declared at the WHO, you are a lawyer expecting now that some answers and some actions will take place as we are no longer under this pandemic. Is that correct?
This is absolutely right, yeah.
Okay. Fundamentally, what are the main human rights that you feel have been violated over these last few years under the context of COVID?
Well, I hardly find a fundamental human right that was not violated in the past 3 years. You can just go through the list in our constitution and you can tackle each of these fundamental rights, starting with human dignity. Elderly people, children were absolutely deprived of their human dignity, of their personal freedom to move. That applies to all the society, but also the personal freedom to protect their body integrity, not to wear harmful masks that didn't bring any benefit, not to be subject to an experimental treatment. They had to, many people who wanted to, either because they wanted to have access to social life, others had to in order to perform their jobs. Then also, of course, the freedom of perform your own business and not to be deprived by the government from your business once you decided not to have a, not to control the certificate. Not far from here, we have a restaurant in Zermatt called Walliserkane, and the owners of the restaurants, they decided not to perform this duty of having this COVID pass imposed to their guests. And the police came and gave them 1-2 chances, and then they closed this restaurant down. They forced this family to apply coercion on their customers, and they forced ultimately the family to have this COVID pass applied to themselves. And more. I mean, there's literally not one fundamental right that was not violated. And the striking here is it was not just violated for a short period of time, not just for a couple of people. It was violated for months and months and months and for entire Switzerland. And this is the most significant violation of fundamental rights ever in Swiss history. And it was done without a proper justification. And the minimum that we owe the people who were violated is a proper reassessment of the entire period of the past 3 years. And if this continues to be denied, we will have tensions, we will have legal tensions, we will have social tensions. People will not accept the status of just putting everything under the carpet. And I've not yet even spoken about the mRNA experimental treatment. This is a very sinister chapter in itself.
How would you respond to somebody who would say that in Switzerland we never had any obligatory or mandatory vaccination and people had free consent to either get injected or not?
You are a liar. And I tell you why. Free consent means there's an absence of any form of coercion. You have no pressure in economic terms, you have no pressure from the society, you have no pressure whatsoever. You can make your free decision. And if you decide for a no, it doesn't have any negative consequences. But deciding against vaccination for many people meant they lost their job or they lost access to society in general, and they lost it for a couple of months. You call this freedom of decision? This is coercion. And number two, we have not spoken yet about the quality of information. The Supreme Authorization Agency, Swissmedic, they said these substances are effective and they are safe and they are tested in the same way as every other medical substance before. And this is a blunt lie. Swissmedic authorized these substances under the title of befristete Zulassung, so limited in time, limited authorization for just 2 years, because there were no proofs of evidence, no evidence of efficacy and safety at the time of authorization. But also there were no further studies delivered that delivered this proof of efficacy and of safety, not even until today. And still, how can you then say that we have performed the same scrutiny of careful examination also with respect to these experimental substances? People will read this in our first, but also in the very soon coming second updated version of our criminal complaint against Swissmedic in all details, that Swissmedic has actually not only provided wrong information to the people, but has had the intent to lie to the people.
So what are the foundational principles upon which you have filed a criminal complaint against Swissmedic?
Let's talk about Swissmedic, our supreme supervising authority responsible for the safety of medical products. We submitted our criminal complaint mid-July last year, 2022. Some 700 pages. Half of it was the legal part and half of the evidence. And I had the help, I must say, of a great team. It would have been impossible to do it alone myself. So I had a great team, and even scientists, doctors from all over the world, they helped us tremendously. Then literally none of the preconditions that must be fulfilled for even an emergency authorization, none of these minimal conditions were met. And then in addition, Swissmedic totally ignored all the signals of unsafety and the fact that actually these substances don't work. They don't prevent any disease from coming. In fact, the opposite is true. We have more and more evidence, and very strong, even peer-reviewed studies, meanwhile, that say the more somebody was vaccinated, the higher the risk to be infected and severely ill with COVID-19. So we collected this evidence that over time, since end of 2020, really piled up, literally piled up. And I needed a scientific co-worker just to deal with all of these studies. She went through the studies day and night for months to bring order in it and to collect them, make them available. So Swissmedic ignored all of that, and we are talking here about peer-reviewed studies. We're talking about studies that were in the public sphere, available to Swissmedic. Then this second point, pharmacovigilance. Mistakes can happen. It can happen that under political pressure, an authority does and performs an act of authorization that under standard, usual terms they would never have done. But then, when such an office, Swissmedic, should have performed a proper observation of this product on the market, carefully observing all the associated risks, and not only on the Swiss market, but also on the entire globe. We had so strong databases from the United States, from Europe, showing clearly that there was never so far a vaccine or any medical product brought on the market that had such a high risk associated, just from the official from the official data. Swissmedic should have established a system of, as we call it, pharmacovigilance, so the control of the product when it has entered the market, in a way that allowed to come to a very, very good understanding and quick understanding as to these two main elements, efficacy and safety. And this they didn't do. at all. We have heard from so many people calling us from the hospitals who were in despair, telling us that every day they see young people with all kinds of strange diseases, heart attacks, brain attacks, and when they, as the medical personnel, but not the chief doctor, propose it to the chief doctor, shouldn't we check also a potential connection with the vaccines? They are turned down. The doctors don't want to know. Also, I have many clients who have really absolutely established a connection between this inoculation and then right afterwards side effects, heavy side effects. And you cannot believe how many doctors they had to see until the first doctor said, okay, I will consider a connection between the vaccine and your deterioration of health. So this was clearly within the scope of Swissmedic to instruct the doctors to make sure that there is a system in place that allows to detect the real side effects of these vaccines. They didn't do it. And number three, information of the public. It is the duty of such an authority to give the public a clear understanding of the true efficacy and of true status of the safety. And they, until very recently, they had on their homepage, we don't know anything about severe side effects. And they also wrote on the homepage, we subjected these substances to the same scrutiny as we did for all other substances. How can you say that? That's absolutely not true. They are blunt lies. So I'm not going into the technical details why we consider this behavior relevant on the Swiss criminal law, but these are our basic elements of our of our criminal claim. Then of course, this criminal complaint was submitted not by us as lawyers. We were just entrusted with this work. It was done in the name of 6 victims who suffered or still suffer severe side effects from these vaccines. So also then clearly we have to bring forward the bodily harm that was done to them. Actually, one client died as a consequence of this vaccine. In this case, it were the parents who entrusted us with submitting the criminal complaint. This person who died was 20. This woman was 20 at the age when she died, at the time she died. So we had 6 victims who wanted to pursue this claim. And as since then, when we first submitted this claim in July last year, so many new studies have come up and so much new evidence and statistics have come to light. I have decided to submit an amended version of our evidence and accordingly also amend our criminal complaint. And we are about to finalize it. We will submit it end of June, beginning of July latest. And we will publish it again because it shall made available to the public.
So Swissmedic maintained that the benefits outweigh the risks and that these cases that you're speaking of are incredibly rare. How would you answer to someone who claims that?
Read our criminal complaint, the evidence report. Yeah, I mean, we have submitted and we have published this criminal complaint on a separate homepage 14th of November last year, and since then I've not received one single email, neither from media nor from any person nor from a scientific background person telling me that we were wrong. So please go to our homepage, tell me and prove me where we are wrong. And you are alluding at a study that was published summer last year, making the case that these vaccines have prevented so many people from becoming sick and from dying, and therefore the benefit was obvious. And we have invested much time to go to the roots of these studies. And this study is not scientific. It's not a basis for making this claim.
The WHO is talking about and negotiating some amendments to the international health regulations and this new instrument called a pandemic treaty. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, based on these experiences from the COVID crisis, the WHO during 2021 very early started about gaining more power to be better prepared, to have better control. And right now we are in the middle of this process of these two instruments to be negotiated with the purpose that the WHO, the World Health Organization, will have much more power than already so far to, number one, declare a pandemic, a so-called public health emergency of international concern, whenever they think it is time to declare so, to have then the power to make whatever recommendations they find fit for the purpose that will have a legal binding effect as a result. Although so far it might be not very easy to find this explicit in the wording of the international health regulations. And that means ultimately for the citizens that our protection of our self-determination, bodily self-determination, and also protection of our rights, including also of our business interest, will be gone. We will have no state court, even less than we had it before, that will have an effective protection of our rights to be assured. And what also the WHO intends, and we see that in both of these legal instruments, they want to have a total control on the global information whenever it could have something to do with health. This is outrageous. They even want to reserve the right to interfere in all social media, social communication, and will exercise the right to censor, which they have done already so far via all these big international social media networks.
I say Google and YouTube
Absolutely.
and Facebook since 2020 already. Anything that contradicts the recommendations of the WHO is immediately taken off.
Yes, so that means, we will have more of the past in the future, but in a stricter manner. We will have already now, it was declared by WHO, jointly together with the European Commission, they have established already their concept of an electronic health certificate, which is based on the so far existing European COVID certificate, to which you can attach all kinds of conditions. The WHO will be in the position to say, okay, we recommend now that traveling shall be possible and allowed only to those who can prove that they have a vaccine twice or 3 times applied of this and this provenience, of this and this manufacturer. They have the total monopoly to determine any medical treatment, although health by definition is something that should be fine-tuned between a doctor and the patient individually. And so this health certificate to me, is one of the most disturbing concepts, because the WHO, as it was done already so far, can say, we consider everybody as a potentially dangerous bioweapon unless this person can present its health certificate, and only then this person shall be allowed to have access to traveling, but also maybe access to stores, to shops, to bank accounts. So we will be very easy to be put under control. It will be very easy for WHO to put us under control. And all of this comes under the title of pandemic preparedness, prevention, and pandemic response. That means whenever the director of the World Health Organization just pretends to act under one of these titles and says, look, we have to do that, this is part of pandemic prevention, then these recommendations will have to be followed in fact. And I give you one example, just one article of the International Health Regulations, these amendments that are on the table since end of 2021. This is Article 13A, and it clearly states that member states undertake to follow WHO's recommendations. And I mean, you could not make it more explicit, the intention of the WHO to make their recommendations legally binding, let alone all these committees that are part of both of these instruments that shall make sure that all of these changes will be implemented. Recommendations will be followed. If they will not be followed, there will be a reporting process, ultimately to the World Health Assembly or to specific committees and bodies. Now, and what else do we need to mention? All these changes, they are pushed forward with a very high dynamic, without ever the WHO looking back into the past, without any self-criticism and without any independent reassessment, or I would call it after-action review. How good was this risk assessment based on PCR test method? We all know that PCR cannot be taken as a proof for a disease, for a specific pathogen as a proof to be a cause for a disease. And we all know, we should know by now, that these mRNA experimental new substances are absolutely not safe, they are not effective. The opposite is true. We have very carefully drafted peer-reviewed studies that even show that the more people are vaccinated, the higher the rate of getting COVID-19, even severely. So I'm personally worried about these changes of both of these legal instruments, and it goes without saying that there's no mechanism established in neither of these instruments that could be seen as a checks and balances mechanism that would allow actually the member states, or let's say even the citizens, to put a question mark behind the necessity, the safety, the efficacy of a measure, or even to have this public health emergency subject to a reassessment. Now, it is in the free discretion of 1 to 3 people in Geneva to decide in which legal status the entire globe will be. So there will be no stop button for them and no mechanism to control them. And this is by definition against our constitutional order. It is against also the principle of self-determination of the countries, the principle of sovereignty, which is enshrined nowhere less than in the United Nations Charter of 1946, Article 1. One of the basic founding principles was the self-determination of the peoples. So all of this will be put at risk. It's like if you would hand over a key of power of all the different member states into one hand of the Director General. And this we must oppose.
Someone would say, but we have delegates who are representing each country, which are there to speak at the World Health Assembly and have their say in what's happening, and it has to be a majority vote, so our interests are being covered.
This is the theory, yes. They should actually represent our interests. Representing our interest also means that they inform the people what is at stake, that they come to us now, I'm talking about June 2023, and inform us without we have to call them, and come proactively, inform their parliaments, inform their people, their press, and say, look, here we are about to negotiate a total new World Health order, a new World Health regime. And ultimately it will be very concerning for our country, for our sovereignty, for the business, for people's own rights. So the normal way of having these fundamental changes become a constitutionally binding law would be to inform the people and to bring them into a democratic debate. This should happen now. And the opposite is true. Our government is hiding this process. We have seen now 2 or 3 requests from members of parliament to our Swiss government, really specifically asking what is the purpose of these negotiations, what is actually the strategy or the stance the Swiss government takes in it, and what can we see right now being negotiated. Response was like if they would ask, like if they would respond to a little child, look, wait little child, we are about to negotiate until May 2024. We cannot tell you because this is still a process on the negotiation. And by the way, you can have a look at the homepage of the Federal Office of Health. Look what you find there. You will find nothing. You will find nothing at all. Not even the most recent drafts that are being negotiated. So this is how you speak to a child that you don't take serious. And this is very sad. This is actually for me the proof that the delegates of at least our country, but I think the same is true for other countries as well, they don't care at all about the interests of the people.
So what do they care about? What are their interests?
In my view, what we can see is that this organization with the name World Health Organization does not pursue the health of the people. This organization is rather acting as an agency in the interest of the manufacturers, of those who want to sell the products, who want to make business, be it medical products, be it IT products, surveillance products. We have never seen a serious assessment as to whether one of these techniques, tools, medications, surveillance tools did ever meet the purpose
of improving public health.
For the purpose of public health. And the purpose of public health is the only founding principle of WHO's own constitution, Article 1. It's only about health of the people. So this is how you measure the efficacy of this organization. They don't care about our interests. So, yeah, about what interests do they care? Well, so far what we see is they care very well about the interests of the manufacturers who want to sell their products, their medical products, their IT products. and nobody cares about the side effects, about any collateral damages. And so nobody is interested in any form of accountability. And as we are ultimately those who have to pay for all of these substances and pay for also the collateral damages, we must have a stand as people and as individual, number one, to be protected against any harmful treatment or harmful so-called recommendations.
So talking about whose interests, who actually funds the WHO? Because most people believe that it's paid by member states.
Yeah.
But what are the other payers and projects?
Well, that was original the case for until, I would say, 15 years ago maybe. But today 80% of the funding of the WHO is related to certain projects. The sponsors who bring in these fundings, they tie their funding to certain conditions so that they benefit 80% of the money. And that shows that the WHO is not anymore independent to pursue the interests of the people's health. It is by 80% directed by the interests of sponsors. Now, telling names, well, number one sponsor, the first one, United States, Germany right now, number one sponsor by far. Then comes already Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Then we have Gavi, which also is heavily influenced, if not controlled, by Bill and Melinda Gates. So these are the top funders. And as I said, if 80% of the funding is related to certain conditions, then it would certainly not be wrong to say that the WHO is under control of these players, mainly the ones who pay them. Interestingly, China is not among the 4 or 5 biggest funders. Russia, very, very low funding, interestingly.
China was commended by the WHO for their response to their pandemic, which was lockdowns. We all saw what happened in Wuhan. Why do you think that China was given as an example of what we should be doing when we know that China is run by communists? There isn't exactly respect for human rights, and that the WHO already has IHR and pandemic preparedness documents in place, none of which recommend systematic lockdowns of everybody, of the whole population, regardless of your status as far as being ill or not.
Well, I have to speculate, to be honest. I don't know it for sure. Nobody knows it for sure. But you are alluding at a comment Tedros made, the general director of WHO, on 30th of January 2020. That was the day when he first declared a COVID public health emergency of international concern. So that was done after he returned from China, and he said more or less, well, I was impressed by what China did. Their response by doing a lockdown was the right thing to do. And more or less he said, take China as an example. If we all do the same, we will certainly have good chances to win this fight against COVID-19. That was the underlying message, how I perceived it, and probably how it was perceived by the world, or how Tedros wanted the world to perceive it. I think that, well, the plan was more or less to make sure that the entire globe did the same and followed this communist model. Forget about democracy, forget also about science, because it was WHO 2019 who clearly stated up to then that certainly lockdowns would not be part of an effective, reasonable way to respond to a pandemic. And suddenly they switched it just with the beginning of COVID.
So what do you make out of that?
Well, in one sentence, we see a new regime coming, an even more tightened regime than what we have seen already. The WHO clearly intends to take all of what can be considered as public health matters into their hands, even reaching on to biodiversity matters, climate change aspects, zoonotic, as they call, or animal to animal transmission, all of that, into ultimately a global monopolistic, never seen before power structure with a top-down approach, reaching into our daily lives, not anymore just during a specific pandemic, but for everything that they would consider to be pandemic prevention and preparedness. And as we said, there will be no accountability for any form of harm they cause, for any collateral damage. No transparency as to how these recommendations actually were developed, by whom, into whom's interest, and also, yes, no mechanism of control, of checks and balances, of a reassessment and of a correction. And ultimately that means that we are looking at potential very long and sinister duration of regime, centralized top-down by WHO, without for us having a chance to stop it. And this cannot be our future. This shall not be our future. So let's step out and step up our endeavors. Let's get engaged and make sure that our voices are being heard. Actually, we must these two big new legal instruments stop. We must make sure that they are not signed, which is in the program to be done for May next year, 2024. And there's still a way to go.
So what can a regular citizen do about that? If you talk about raising our voices, what can we actually do?
Well, we must have a bottom-up approach. The regular citizen has to activate his political representative. The political representative and the members of parliament, they have to challenge the government. They have to ask tough questions. How do you make sure that the people's rights are being preserved? How do you make sure that the WHO will never abuse their power to declare a pandemic? How do you make sure that any recommendation is solely done as long as there is a clear benefit for the people and not for the manufacturers? And why don't you inform the people? It is absolutely invalid to change basic fundamental principles of any country without asking the people. Bottom-up approach, put some pressure, put a lot of pressure, much more pressure on your political representative. And the political representative, members of parliament, they have to put pressure, enormous pressure, on their respective governments so that the delegates negotiating these agreements, they have to report to us how they ensure that our rights, our self-determination is protected. If they cannot provide a clear guarantee that the people and civil societies, as they call it, that we ultimately will be protected, that our health, that our self-determination will truly be protected, the entire development has to come to an end, has to be stopped. And ultimately, even I don't see an alternative from leaving the WHO if the WHO does not understand itself what interests of the people need to be observed. And these are eternal interests. As long as there are human beings, there are human rights and the self-determination. So if WHO does not understand this concept, it's not our WHO.
But how can you leave the WHO? There's no clause for divorce.
It is all about pressure bottom-up pressure. And this is, you could say, wishful thinking, but without a clear idea, we will never come to the goal. And I must also clearly say, this is a challenge that cannot be done without the help from qualified people, lawyers, politicians. We all now have to work together. This is much more than just COVID-19, this single event. This is about structuring our future and our future constitutions. So we need to find a way how to involve those who have so far not been involved. And I try personally my best to explain the consequences of these two legal instruments to those who so far have simply not understood.
Because there's no media reporting on these two instruments either. There's complete media silence.
Yes, complete media silence. This is absolutely not justifiable.
So what was the source of this pandemic?
Well, this is exactly the point. I mean, how can you structure a total new set of a regime of empowerment and so on without having looked into the source of the last pandemics? We're talking here about a pathogen that was manipulated, that was fabricated, and fabricated by way of gain of function. And we're talking about state actors. This is not something that takes place on the market of Wuhan. I mean, this is long-term, highly qualified manipulation of pathogens. And so clearly that would be the first thing to look up for anybody in order to prevent this from happening again in the future. And it is a sign of actually bad intentions that WHO has not addressed this point with stringency and consequence, and has not yet established who actually produced this virus. And keep in mind that all these state actors, they are producing the next virus, the next pathogen, and the next pandemic. All of this is so sinister that we need to step in.
Interesting you mentioned trust, because the WHO is very aware that they're losing trust of the people, and it's one of the things that they'd like to address, but it seems that they're addressing it principally through censorship. Instead of engaging and listening to what the concerns are, it's flat out refusing to actually enter into the debate. Do you have any comments on maybe what they could do to gain trust?
Yes, absolutely. If I would have to advise the WHO or Tedros, the first thing to regain trust is to do a serious after-action review done by independent experts and accept what they say. Accept that if they would come up with the conclusion that the way how the WHO actually did their risk assessment, how dangerous was COVID-19, what was COVID-19 in the first place, where did it come from? The most important way of regaining trust and of gaining trust is to show that you are capable of learning from past mistakes, that you have established a mechanism that allows to identify mistakes. And independent, constant reassessment over the time, even during the pandemic, that makes sure that the risk assessment of the beginning, just based on PCR cases, would be put under scrutiny. And that we would not call out a pandemic longer than really necessary. Put all the countries under restrictions longer than really necessary. And so this is actually one of our basic concern and points where I must say that WHO has proven that they are not up to protecting public health as long as they don't establish this mechanism of a constant review of, number one, the problem, and number two, of their solutions. And this reassessment is necessary to improve the quality of your public health management. They avoid that even until today. And the second point is, which creates distrust, which takes trust away, is if the WHO tells the world we are the only ones who always know what is the truth, what is right for the people, and what information must be banned. There is no such thing as a total, absolute truth in the hands of a very few. We have learned that in Europe in the past 2,000 years, probably in the rest of the world as well. And this claim in itself by the WHO to be in possession of the absolute truth, this is so outrageous. It is not a good basis for creating trust.
They basically want to be a monopoly on public health information.
Yeah, they want, yes, monopoly on public health and the monopoly on power and monopoly on truth.
So you're a tax lawyer.
Yes.
People would say, well, who are you to talk about the WHO? What is your authority or your expertise to talk on the subject of public health when you're a tax lawyer?
Well, the problems I'm talking about actually are not public health. I talk about those principles, constitutional principles, legal principles that apply very strongly in tax law, but ultimately in most branches of law, in particular all the branches of public law. So I'm talking about, number one, the principle that wherever the government, the state, interferes with your rights and takes away your liberty or your health or your money, it needs a clear constitutional basis for this capacity and authority. It needs a clear legal basis, and most of all, the burden of proof is with the government. So I was asking then right from the beginning, looking at this interference, these interventions, they were much stronger than just imposing taxes. This interference, as of March 2020 in Switzerland, was comparable of increasing tax from one moment to another by 200% to many people. So I was asking, okay, what would be needed to increase tax by 200% from one day to another? A strong constitutional basis, a strong legal basis, the right of being heard, the necessity to reassess the facts that were presented in the media, and all of that in an apparent obvious way. If a government comes and say, oh look, we have to rob you, take away your rights, just like that, because there are some pictures from Wuhan, some pictures from Bergamo, they better come up with the proof that the necessity is really, truly given. So the burden of proof was one thing, the legal basis another thing, and then also the principle of having an independent legal reassessment and reconsideration. So this is why I started putting literally all types of restrictions to the scrutiny, subject to the scrutiny of courts. And so the answer actually to your question is, we're talking here about constitutional methods, legal methods. We're not talking about science, about health in the technical terms, but we are talking about the methods to find out the best solution in science, the best solution in a specific field, which here is public health. And the method is to be always prepared for a reconsideration, for an improvement of the decision, and to have the best experts brought into the debate to improve your decisions. The decision-making process must be fed on the basis of the best possible available science, and science is a process in development. It is clear that a public health organization, they don't have all the information at the table right away the first day. But the more time goes by, the more information is on the table. And the more studies are produced, and the more conclusions can be considered together. So there is no, and this is another constitutional principle, for the government, there is no right of perpetuating errors to eternity. To the opposite. Based on the principle of proportionality, the government has to subject its own decisions all the time to a critical reassessment in order to make sure that every restriction does not last longer than really necessary to meet the purpose. So there's no right to commit errors forever. Errors must be stopped, and from errors it must be learned. So from these methodological aspects, I then, of course, started to understand the relevant facts, the legally relevant facts. I was looking for the contact to scientists. I engaged in professional cooperation with mathematicians, statisticians, medical doctors from all of the world, actually. And this is where I am today. We have very strong global team. We work all together. And in one nutshell, as a lawyer, I try to establish the process which allows the doctors and the scientists to be finally heard. And to be allowed to present their facts and to fight any form of censorship.
Which we've seen plenty of since 2020.
And for this, you don't need to be a WHO expert.
And it's the first time that we have a WHO director who's not actually even a medical doctor. I believe
Yes.
Tedros is the first ever Director General he was a public health minister in Ethiopia, but has no medical background.
Yep.
And someone like him who's able to declare a fake, what are the dangers of that for our constitution, essentially?
Well, such a declaration of fake equals to a suspension of our constitution, of all key elements of our constitutional order, in the same time also for all other countries. I'm talking here, number one already, about the sovereignty of any government to determine the priorities of the state. All other priorities we have to put in the background. Priority number one was the war against a virus. Then the principle of the rule of law, we call it in Switzerland the principle of legality, Legalitätsprinzip, was replaced by the rule of emergency. So that it was just a small group of people who were allowed to define the legal status of Switzerland being in status of emergency, and that created a situation whereby capacities and competences of the lawmakers were shifted to the government. Usually the government would never have the capacity to interfere with the right of the people, to interdict the economy from flowing, to prohibit people from walking around, participating in economy, in social interaction, even prohibiting some branches actually to work without being vaccinated. This would never be possible without a thorough, long-term public political debate leading ultimately to a formalized legislation. So this is within the capacity of the legislator combined with the Swiss population, because in Switzerland the legislator is not only the parliament but also the entire population that can demand a referendum. The point I make here is a fake can and was used already as a pretext to suspend the constitution. As I said, the lawmakers are not anymore in the lead. It is only the government, as if we were at war. Number two, all the decisions, the major decisions, are not anymore taken even by the government, but they are taken by the WHO in form of recommendations. It was not the idea of the Swiss government to use just PCR tests and to impose these new experimental vaccines on people. That was the idea promoted by the WHO.
We've heard a lot about excess mortality in the last few years, which wasn't seen so much during 2020, but which we've seen in 2021 and 2022. Have you done any research on this excess mortality in Switzerland or outside?
Yes. Actually, this excess mortality question was the beginning of all of my research in September, maybe even August 2020, and it has remained in the core of my research since then. The method who can perform this task, the only method, and it's a method officially recognized by WHO, is called the age standardized death rate. So if you apply this method, and this is a WHO method, and you compare this year 2020 to all the previous years, you don't arrive at an excess mortality. You find this year 2020 to be somewhere, if you compare with the previous 10 years, somewhere in the rank 5 or 6 in the middle field, but certainly not in above the top. There's a group of age that indeed is higher than the previous 10 years, and this is the group of age 80 plus. So what does this tell us? We have again to look into the details, and we find, okay, this surplus is minimal, higher than the year 2015, where already there were some quite significant high numbers. So with respect to 2020, I want to say that there is a slight higher mortality for the age group of 80 plus, but only slightly higher than it was 2015, so clearly not justifying interventions of historical proportions, historical dimensions, and of a harmful nature. The average age of person who died in this second wave was 84 years old. Of course, they are also human beings, but it must be part of our overall policy that we take into account, are we talking about an average of age of people who died of 30 or 40, or it's 84? So we need to protect then those who are 84. The others are not under threat. Number two, actually, we must note that there are also other reasons we can clearly identify responsible for the death of people who are already 84. Natural reasons, but also the consequences of the measures themselves. I mean, many of these people, 84, were in
old people, nursing homes?
Nursing homes, right, in nursing homes. So actually these nursing homes were literally shut down, and the family members were not allowed to visit in many cases. So these poor elderly people sat there alone at the age of 80, even older, waiting for a visit that never come, even with a mask in front of them, and not being even allowed to go out. This in itself is a cause for death. And we see that if we look at the statistics, because we see this peak of so-called, technically, excess mortality. And if we subtract from this peak, all those who died with a positive PCR, we still have an extraordinary peak with those who did not die with a positive PCR. And this is a matter of fact. I can show you the figures. These people, of course, I confronted already some officials with this fact, and they would then say, this is just because we missed out to subject them to a PCR test, which of course would then have been positive as well. Well, no, simply accept that also the measures had the potential to kill people. So that was with respect to 2020. Now, what is the perspective with, let's say, 2021, 2022? So the further away we come from this pandemic year 2020, our attention actually is to identify the consequences of the harmful experimental substances. And there we see, number one, do we have an excess mortality under this very traditional safe method I mentioned at the beginning, the age standardized rate of death? No, we don't see that. Those age groups who were absolutely not affected in 2020 by COVID, I'm talking here about all age groups, below 60, below 70, we see that in particular the age group of 30 to 40, 40 to 50 suddenly show a rise in death counts in absolute figures. They show a rise in death counts in the year 2021, 2020, without COVID being any more a dangerous phenomenon. So where does this come from? And where does the decline in birth rate comes from that was observed a year ago, starting in April, May 2022? It was observable then. So that was about, the effect was seen as of April, May 2022, this decline in birth rate, significant, never seen before since the beginning of World War I. There was a similar decline, but just briefly. Now, just by chance, this decline of birth rate happened to start just 9 months after the vaccination activity in 2021 started for younger people who wanted to go to vacation. For vacation purposes, it was a question, well, if we want to go to Spain, we have to be vaccinated. Otherwise, we cannot enter the country. So, or to United States. Or for other reasons, younger people decided to get vaccinated. I know many people. So, it is not a proof, it is just a correlation, but we see this very obvious correlation that 9 months after vaccination, mRNA vaccination activity started in 2021, we see this significant decline in birth rates, which continues to persist until these days. And of course it has come to the attention of the public media. And the only thing they say is, well, we can say one thing for sure.
It's not the vaccine.
It is not the vaccine. So now you tell me what it is. if it is so significant and so
it's a heat wave.
Lasting for so long, it cannot be the heat wave. It cannot even be the motivation of the people say, oh, well, suddenly we renounce on children.
It's very interesting in Switzerland, the canton that had one of the highest vaccination rates, which I believe was Basel, actually also has the highest fertility dip since many years. But Swissmedic maintains that it has nothing to do with the vaccine. The official OFSP also insists that it has nothing to do with the vaccine. How would you respond to someone? How do you force these authorities to actually look into it as opposed to just dismiss it?
Well, I just think it's a political debate. It's a public debate that needs to be initiated based on very strong figures, and among others, maybe also based on something like our criminal complaint. We not only submit it, but we will also publish the updated version very soon.